Meet Jake and Alex, both 30 years old, both living in Columbus, Ohio, both earning the exact same salary, $75,000 a year. After years of meal prepping instead of eating out, driving the same car 3 years longer than they probably should, and mastering the art of, I'm just grabbing one thing, grocery runs that somehow cost $80, they've each managed to save $85,000. Financially, they're identical twins. Personality-wise, not even close. Jake wants roots, a place that's unmistakably his, a garage for tools he'll use maybe twice a year, a lawn he'll start caring about far more than he ever expected to, and the freedom to paint a wall of noxious orange if the mood strikes. Alex is wired the opposite way. He likes keeping his options open. He has no idea where he'll be in 5 years, and honestly, that's exactly how he likes it. The idea of being tied to one mortgage, one zip code for the next 30 years sounds less like stability to him and more like a life sentence. Same income, same savings, same starting line, completely different roads. Jake buys a house. Alex keeps renting. And for the next 20 years, we're going to track every dollar, every mortgage payment, every rent increase, every surprise repair bill, and every dollar Alex invests instead of sinking into a down payment. At the end, we'll see where two people who started with identical numbers actually ended up once real life happened to both of them. Let's get into it. Jake and Alex are currently renting in the same city. After 4 months of house hunting, 4 dozen listings, and more open houses than Jake would like to admit to, he finds it. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a fenced backyard, and a garage big enough to store home gym equipment he will use for exactly 1 January. The house costs $375,000. Jake puts down $75,000 minus 20%, which lets him skip private mortgage insurance entirely. That leaves a $300,000 mortgage, but the down payment isn't the whole bill. There are closing costs, lender fees, title insurance, appraisal, prepaid property taxes, and roughly 40 pages of documents he signs while understanding maybe 6 of them. Closing costs typically run 2 to 5% of the purchase price. So on a $375,000 home, that's realistically another $8,000 to $18,000. For this comparison, let's say Jake's closing costs land at $10,000. So before he's moved a single box, Jake has spent his entire $85,000 in savings, $75,000 for the down payment, $10,000 in closing costs. He locks in a 30-year fixed mortgage at 6.5%, close to the long-run historical average for a 30-year fixed rate, which has swung anywhere from 3% to over 7% depending on the decade. His monthly principal and interest payment comes out to about $1,896, but that's not the whole monthly cost. Add roughly $375 in property taxes, $140 in homeowner's insurance, and about $310 a month Jake sets aside for maintenance, following the common real estate rule of thumb of budgeting around 1% of a home's value per year for repairs and upkeep. Total monthly housing cost, about $2,721. Alex's math looks completely different. He rents a comparable 3-bedroom nearby for $2,150 a month. No property taxes, no homeowner's insurance, and if the furnace dies in February, that's a phone call to the landlord, not a $4,000 invoice. That leaves Alex with about $571 extra every month compared to Jake. For a moment, that number starts looking suspiciously like a flight to Lisbon, but Alex resists. Instead, he takes the $85,000 he didn't spend on a house and puts it straight into a low-cost S&P 500 index fund. From that point forward, the $571 he saves each month by renting goes into the same account. Early on, Alex's decision looks strong. Comparable home, lower monthly cost, and his money is working in the market instead of sitting in drywall. Now this is usually where someone jumps in with, sure, but Alex is throwing $2,150 a month away on rent. Jake's mortgage is building equity. Technically true, but misleading. In the early years, a mortgage builds equity brutally slowly because most of the payment is interest, not principal. In Jake's very first month, $1,625 of his $1,896 payment is interest. Add the $375 in taxes, $140 in insurance, and $310 for maintenance, and out of his full $2,721 monthly housing cost, only about $271 actually builds equity. The other $2,450 is simply the price of shelter, dressed up to look like an investment. Meanwhile, Alex's $2,150 in rent builds zero equity. That part is true. But treating mortgage interest, property tax, insurance, and a leaking roof as investing while calling rent wasted money is creative accounting, not honest accounting. Both men are paying for a place to sleep. One of them is also paying a bank for the privilege of eventually owning it outright. Fast forward 3 years. Jake has made 36 mortgage payments and learned Rule 1 of home ownership. Once you own the house, every strange sound has a price tag attached. One Sunday, the water heater dies. Jake watches a video titled, "Anyone Can Fix a Water Heater in 20 Minutes." 3 hours later, he calls a plumber. The repair costs a few $100s. Annoying, but exactly what his maintenance budget exists for. After 3 years, Jake's mortgage balance has dropped from $300,000 to about $289,000. Just over $11,000 of principal paid down. Assuming the home appreciates at a realistic 3 to 4% a year, it's now worth somewhere between roughly $410,000 and $422,000. That puts Jake's home equity at approximately $121,000 to $133,000. That's real, if illiquid wealth. Alex, meanwhile, has paid about $77,400 in rent over those 3 years. But his original $85,000 has stayed invested. At a 9% average annual return, a reasonable long-run estimate for a diversified stock index, though real markets are far bumpier year to year, that initial sum alone has grown to roughly $110,000. Add the monthly contributions and their growth, and Alex's total portfolio is now worth roughly $134,000. So after 3 years, it's essentially a tie. Jake has meaningful home equity, Alex has a meaningful portfolio. Jake can knock down a wall if he wants to. Alex can move to another state next month with 30 days notice. As the years pass, the two situations start pulling apart. Jake's principal and interest payment is locked. That never changes for 30 years. But his total cost of ownership isn't fixed. As the home's value rises, property taxes rise with it. Insurance premiums creep up. And as the house ages, repair bills stop being replace a faucet and start being replace a roof. Alex has a rising cost of his own, rent. He starts at $2,150 a month, but it climbs roughly 3% a year, a fairly typical pace for U.S. rent growth over long stretches, though it varies a lot by city and by decade. $2,150 becomes $2,215, then $2,281, then a little more the year after that. Nothing about the apartment changed, just the number leaving Alex's account every month. His landlord, it turns out, also believes in compounding. As rent keeps climbing and Jake's payment stays flat, the $571 monthly cushion Alex started with slowly shrinks. This is where time starts quietly working in Jake's favor. But Alex still has one major advantage that hasn't been fully counted yet: opportunity cost. His original $85,000 has been compounding in the market this entire time, and at a 9% average return, that sum alone has serious potential to grow over 2 decades, before a single monthly contribution is added on top. This doesn't mean Jake made a mistake. His $85,000 went toward an asset that was also appreciating and building equity. But that money had an alternative use, and a fair comparison has to account for it on both sides. Jump ahead to year 10. Jake is 40. His home, still appreciating at 3 to 4% a year, is now worth somewhere between roughly $504,000 and $555,000. After a decade of payments, his loan balance has fallen to about $254,000. That puts his home equity at roughly $250,000 to $301,000. He now walks through his own kitchen with the quiet confidence of a man who owns most of the cabinets outright. Over that decade, he's also spent real money on maintenance and repairs. Some of it added value, some of it simply kept the house from slowly returning to nature. Alex has kept investing the whole time. At a 9% average annual return, his original $85,000 alone is now worth roughly $201,000. Add in a decade of monthly contributions, which started at $571 but shrank gradually as rent climbed, and Alex's total portfolio is worth roughly $295,000. So after 10 years, Alex is still ahead on paper, but his rent isn't $2,150 anymore. After a decade of 3% annual increases, it's closing in on $2,890 a month, while Jake's principal and interest payment is still exactly $1,896. Now to year 20. Jake and Alex are both 50. Jake's home, appreciating at 3 to 4% a year, is now worth somewhere between roughly $677,000 and $822,000. His mortgage balance has fallen to about $167,000, leaving him with somewhere between $510,000 and $655,000 in home equity. Alex's portfolio has also been compounding for 2 decades. His original $85,000 alone is now worth roughly $476,000 at a 9% annual return. Add the monthly contributions and their growth on top, and Alex's total portfolio is worth roughly $790,000. So on pure net worth, after 20 years, Alex comes out ahead. But the two piles of wealth don't behave the same way. Alex's money is liquid. He can sell shares with a few taps on his phone. Jake cannot sell 6% of his kitchen, at least not without triggering some very serious questions from a future buyer. Alex, though, still has a cost that never goes away: rent. After 20 years of 3% annual increases, his original $2,150 rent is now around $3,880 a month. Jake, meanwhile, has just 10 years left on his mortgage, and then his housing payment effectively drops to taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Alex's result comes with one enormous asterisk. He actually had to invest the difference every single month for 2 decades. When the market is up, invest. When it drops 30% in a year, invest. When cable news declares the death of capitalism for the 4th time that decade, invest. The spreadsheet assumes discipline. Real humans have other plans. That monthly contribution quietly becomes a nicer car, a couple of extra vacations, a slightly upgraded lifestyle. And 10 years later, the portfolio that looked fantastic on paper never actually made it off the paper. A mortgage, by contrast, is a form of forced saving. Jake never has to decide month after month whether he feels like building equity. The bank already decided for him. Behaviorally, that difference matters enormously, and it's probably the single most underrated variable in this entire comparison. Buying isn't without its own weak points: time. If Jake had sold after year 3, the closing costs going in, the selling costs going out, and years of mostly interest payments could easily have erased his advantage. Buying needs time, usually 7 to 10 years or more, for the math to actually work in your favor. Mobility. Imagine both men get incredible job offers in another state a few years in. Alex gives notice, packs a truck, and leaves. Jake has to choose: sell the house and eat the transaction costs, or become a long-distance landlord, carrying a mortgage in one city, rent in another, and a tenant who may or may not cover the full bill. Any shortfall comes straight out of Jake's pocket. Concentration risk. Alex owns a diversified slice of thousands of companies. Jake owns one house on one street in one neighborhood in one city. If that neighborhood booms, great. If the local economy struggles, Jake can't rebalance by selling off the upstairs bathroom. Liquidity. If Alex needs $20,000 tomorrow, he sells part of his portfolio. If Jake needs $20,000, he's refinancing, taking out a home equity loan, or selling the house. Home equity is real wealth. It's just not particularly spendable wealth. Honestly, it depends. Buying tends to make more sense when you plan to stay put for a long stretch. 7 to 10 years or more gives the transaction cost time to be absorbed, principal paydown time to accumulate, and appreciation time to compound. A fixed payment also becomes more valuable every year rent keeps climbing around it. Buying also makes more sense when home prices are reasonable relative to rent. One rough tool for this is the price to rent ratio. Divide the home's price by the annual rent of a comparable property. Here, $375,000 divided by $25,800 in annual rent gives a ratio of about 14.5. Real estate researchers commonly use 15 as a rough dividing line. Below it, buying tends to look more competitive. Above roughly 20, renting usually starts winning. It's a shortcut, not gospel. Mortgage rates, taxes, insurance, and expected market returns still matter enormously. Renting tends to make more sense when home prices are high relative to rent, when flexibility genuinely matters to your life, and, critically, when the renter actually follows through and invests the difference instead of spending it. And it doesn't have to be either/or. Buying a house doesn't mean you stop investing. Personal finance rarely comes down to one perfect strategy. It comes down to understanding what you're trading away. Jake traded liquidity and mobility for stability, leverage, and long-term control over his housing. Alex traded housing certainty for flexibility, liquidity, and a bigger pile of invested capital. Neither choice was automatically smart. Neither was automatically dumb. It really comes down to 2 questions. First, how long are you actually going to stay? Buy a house and leave 3 years later, and transaction costs will punish you. Second, if you rent, will you actually invest the difference? Rent for 20 years and spend every dollar you save, and the entire advantage evaporates. So no, renting isn't automatically throwing money away. Renters pay rent. Homeowners pay interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and transaction costs. Both are paying for shelter. Homeownership absolutely can build enormous wealth, but it's also an expensive, illiquid asset with concentration risk and a roof that occasionally sends you a $9,000 invoice. The winner here isn't always the homeowner. It isn't always the renter either. Jake needed to stay long enough for buying to pay off. Alex needed to stay disciplined enough for renting to pay off. Because 20 years later, the gap between them didn't come down to who bought and who rented. It came down to what each of them actually did after making that decision. And tell me in the comments, are you buying, renting, or waiting for interest rates and home prices to drop at the exact same time? In which case, I admire your optimism. See you in the next one.